Hello, and welcome to channel Ein Our Key, and I am your host, Voluntary. Alright, time for chapter 4 of Mr. Hovind's text. This is the final chapter of a 16-chapter text. Make of that what you will. In this chapter, he proposes to cover the concept of time. I admit I was surprised at the twists this took. I thought it was going to go in one direction, but instead it went in another, and then another, and then another. Just when I thought he was going to get to the conclusion, he went back to the direction I thought it would take, and then away from it, and then back to it. His writing is normally muddled, but in this case he really and truly lacked direction, since he was already starting to move beyond his core material, insisting that evolution is religion and creation is science. It is not surprising that he seemed a bit more lost. He really doesn't have a lot beyond that, other than random decontextualized quotes that he mistakenly thinks supports his view. He starts off accurately describing two of the many possible positions. The scientific position is that the universe, the Earth, and the biosphere are billions of years old, although he doesn't get at all specific, and that the creationist position is that the universe, the Earth, and the biosphere are thousands of years old. He even states correctly that evolution as we know it cannot have happened if the ages are measured in thousands of years instead of billions of years. I can admit he is actually right about something. If the creationist ages are true, then it is a given that what we know of evolution cannot have happened. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen now, but everything we know about what got us to this point is undetermined. I expected him to start criticizing the many dating methods available. Instead, he asks, what is time? Do you know that feeling you get when you're cruising down the freeway? You're in fourth gear. You want to pass, you reach down to the stick shift to put it in fifth, but you accidentally put it in third and your engine flies out the front of your car. And that's the kind of feeling I got, where he argues that time as we know it doesn't apply to God. He spends 7 pages explaining that. On the bottom of the 4th page, the PDF calls it page 80, although 80 is written down on the next page. He has a black and white photocopy of the color spectrum of what was originally a color illustration. On PDF page 82 and 83, he includes a poem he wrote in the grand tradition of doggerel and doctoral thesis writing, in which he compares atheists to blind people because they are too blind to see that Mr. Hovind's arguments are flawless. On PDF page 84, he suddenly switches to another argument. After all that he wrote about how time as humans know it doesn't apply to God in heaven, he goes absolutely nowhere with it. Instead, he demonstrates the obvious, that if you add up the ages of the people in the Old Testament, you get approximately 4,000 years covered in the Old Testament. I did expect him at this point to go on to criticize radiometric dating. Instead, he attacks his fellow Christians. If one is a Christian who has found a way to reconcile being religious with what has been discovered by science, I say, good for you. Mr. Hovind believes that no matter what they actually say, they are heretics because they don't believe in Mr. Hovind's interpretation of Genesis. It's actually kind of funny how often Mr. Hovind insists that God agrees with Mr. Hovind. So it isn't until PDF page 88 where Mr. Hovind stops telling other Christians that they are wrong because they disagree with Mr. Hovind's interpretation. I could argue with some of his points, but there is no point in doing so. Now he gets to the dating methods used by science. 27 pages in this chapter, 12 pages of meandering nonsense. Did you know that scientists choose dating methods based on what result they want? According to Mr. Hovind, that is what happens. Each method supposedly gives an entirely different result, and scientists choose the one they want. Of course, that isn't the way scientists determine ages, but that is absolutely the way Mr. Hovind says they do it. To further discredit the scientific dates, he comes up with some rather perplexing points that I've never encountered outside of Hovind, or those who in turn quote Mr. Hovind. I searched quite a bit about the problem of cosmic dust and nickel in the Earth's crust that Mr. Hovind talks about. Apparently, scientists aren't even aware that there is a problem here. He describes the slowing rotation of the Earth. If I were to try to use it as evidence, I would include things like numbers and math, so that I could do things like calculate the spin in earlier ages. He doesn't do that, not that I expect him to. He simply expects us to take his word on it. He does describe the decline in the Earth's magnetic field. Of course, a lot of research has gone into the magnetic field in recent years, but even back when this document was written, it was known that the magnetic field of the Earth has fluctuated both in magnitude and direction in the past. To put his arguments in perspective, let us assume that you see a bathtub draining and you measure the rate of the drain. You can extrapolate backwards and conclude, based on the current rate, that at some point yesterday, the whole house was full of water. That is not a logical conclusion, but if Mr. Hovind were to actually use math, that would be the math he uses. He then moves on to the very real problem of distant stars. This really is a conundrum for creationists, because if a star is more than 10,000 light years away, and we can see it, that means absent something unusual that we do not know about, then therefore we are seeing back more than 10,000 years. Yes, parallax can only go a few hundred light years away, but while he acknowledges redshift also exists, he promises to discuss it later. He could go into it right away, but instead decides to snipe at Christians who disagree with Mr. Hovind's interpretation of Genesis. When he is done criticizing Christians, he discusses the Great Barrier Reef and the bristlecone pine. These are very old things. But them being old doesn't mean that they have existed the entire span of Earth's existence. He spends a page and a half discussing oil pressure. Apparently, if oil was under as much pressure as it is now, and if that oil were very close to the surface, it would be squirting out. It is deep under and under a lot of rock pressure, which means it is under different conditions. But if it were under surface conditions, it would have squirted out, proving, well, something. He describes ocean sediment, ocean salinity, surface erosion, and when he describes the rate that each occurs at, he conveniently leaves out all countervailing processes. The ocean does collect salinity, but it also sheds salinity. It does collect sediment, but it also sheds sediment. The earth does have erosion, but there are also processes that build up land masses. Then he jumps back to processes outside of Earth by describing lunar recession, which would fit a lot better had he included it back when he was discussing cosmic dust and comets. Still, he included it here. If I were trying to prove something, I would group my evidence according to kind. Biology, chemistry, astronomy, etc. He just wrote whatever came to mind at that exact moment. As further evidence of writing what occurs at that exact moment, he quotes Dr. Lewis Slitter, a professor of geophysicist at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Knowing how Mr. Hovind likes to take quotes out of context, I looked this up. Then I ran into a problem. First of all, if this person exists, he would be a professor of geophysics and not a professor of geophysicist. Second of all, I found no evidence of this person or his quote. Once he is done presenting some arguments that maybe could show the earth is young, he goes back again to criticize Christians who don't agree with Mr. Hovind. He keeps going back and forth so much, I felt like I was getting whiplash. He finishes off by arguing that the rate of population growth in humanity is a constant, even though it isn't. Then he wants to know why there is no writing from before the invention of writing. Now this last one, which is his last argument in the fourth and final chapter in the 16-chapter text, is an interesting one for me personally. You see, while it is true that the Chinese were not writing things down before the alleged creation of the earth, they were writing before the alleged time of the flood. and during the alleged time of the flood, and after the alleged time of the flood. They forgot to write down that they were underwater. Maybe, just maybe, they didn't have a kanji for glub glub. And this ends Mr. Hovind's attempt to discuss the concept of time, where even he was not sure what he was writing about. And this also ends the fourth and final chapter of a 16-chapter text. Thank you for watching. We're now in the double digits for subscribers, and hopefully we will only keep growing. So please like, share, comment, and subscribe to help my channel grow.